Hi, I'm B from Nectar Mechanics, and in today's video, we're going to be making a giant 3D printed working cassette tape transformer. So as many of you know, I'm a big Transformers nerd, and for over 4 years now, I've wanted to make my own Soundwave figure. For those that don't know, Soundwave was an awesome Decepticon back in the 80s who turned into a cassette player. So it's been my dream for over 4 years now, since I started learning 3D printing, to make my own Soundwave figure that could play proper cassette tapes. Not only that, in the 80s cartoon, Soundwave used to display schematics and blueprints on his chest, and I wanted to do a figure that could do that as well. After I finished my last video, Ravage, I thought it is finally time to try and do it. I found a small cassette player that I could use for the internal components, an old iPod Touch that I could put videos on, its battery life's terrible but it was good for what I needed, and some old headphones which I can dismantle for the speakers. And for that little extra touch, I've got some LEDs for the eyes. Now, I don't want to one-to-one recreate the original Soundwave, so I need to make a rough concept sketch. Soundwave's original cassette player mode is kind of made up. It's not based on a specific model, but most media tends to depict him more like a boombox, so I figured, why not I just make my version of Boombox? Now, I don't want him to look just like Blaster, so I came up with 4 different sketches, some more close to G1, some more of a departure, and I showed them to some friends and they gave me feedback. Most people, myself included, liked the version that looked like his G1 alt mode but with the new boombox handle and bigger speakers on the front, and I thought that was perfect. So now I knew what the boombox looked like, it was time to do the robot. Mine stayed pretty close to G1, but I gave him some big 80s shoulder pads and speakers on the inner legs. So now that I have an idea of what I want it to look like, I need to start designing it. So I figured this project was the time where I would finally dip my toe into parametric sketch-based software. Those are some big words, so let's break it down into small chunks. The parametric part means that when you're modeling in it, you're more adjusting parameters, hence the name. And the sketch-based means that every object starts off as a 2D version, which you then turn into the 3D object. For example, if I want to make a cube in Freecad, I can do a 2D sketch of a square, which I can then constrain by saying, hey, each line that I've just drawn is 20mm specifically, then I can pad that out by 20mm, and I have a perfect 20mm square. Now, if I was to detail that square or edit it later on, and then say, I wish I made it 50mm instead of 20, well, it saved every action I've done in a list, which means that I can go back, adjust that detail in the list, and because it's parametric, that dominoes all the way down and updates the rest of my model. Meaning complex objects like Transformers that need very high precision, if you reference the objects off of each other and adjust them from there, they'll always match up with one another, no matter how much you tweak it. So in 1 week, I taught myself how to use Freecad. I did use videos from MangoJelly Solutions for Freecad, which I will link his channel down in the description below because they were very helpful. So now that I have a basic handle on Freecad, I guess that's enough waffle and I need to actually start the project. I started with the head. My first go at the head, I managed to break. And by break, I mean I messed up the constraints on some of my sketches. Those breakages could domino down the chain. So it was time to do it again. It's a learning experience, it's fine. For take 2, I tried to make the model out of a lot fewer actions. That way I have less points of breakage. I also made it so parts like his visor and mouthplate were separate pieces, so I could do less masking when I go to paint him later. Now, since my last video, I've been able to get my hands on a Prusa Mark IV, so I thought, let's just do a test print right away and see how it goes. It did it in just under an hour, it was all the correct measurements I put in the computer and everything, so now knowing that I can make a model that will successfully print and, export to the slicer, I'm a lot more confident moving ahead doing the rest of the body. Now for this, I mostly built him sort of top down, and for the most part he's going to be symmetrical, so I'm only going to model half of him. I can flip it right at the very end and save myself so much time. So every time I worked on a new piece, I would do really rough sketches before I began modeling. That way, it just gets the idea out of my head a lot easier. And for parts like the torso that were going to interact with the electronics like the cassette player and iPod Touch, digital calipers were definitely my friend. So for the first proper transformation step, I wanted to make the head be able to hide away in Boombox mode. I want to have LEDs in his head, and the cable running into it is going to get twisted, so his head needs to remain upright. I can't just have it fall backwards. So the way I figured out to do this was have it so that his neck was on almost like a sliding track that's in the rest of the body. That way I can shove it back, shove it down, and it's still upright. And then a little panel can just go over the top to hide it all away. Head is upright, cables don't get twisted. It's a pretty good first transformation step in Freecad. Continuing on with the torso, I made stuff like the little gold frame on the front a separate piece, again for ease of painting. It's a very basic thing to do, but it means I just get crisp edges way quicker. So now that I'm happy with the rough torso block out, I got to work on the arms. Sketch-based modeling meant I could do mushroom pegs for the shoulders way easier, doing little T-slots on the bottom and filleting it. That way they could just slide in from the top. I also ended up splitting the shoulder into sections so that it wasn't going to just be flush with his torso. Now, for the lower arms, my original idea was the handle was going to be formed out of his shoulders and his arms, but that looked really chunky for a boombox handle. So instead, I made it so that the shoulders were just the top of the boombox, just the corners, and the forearms split in half to form the entire handle. This meant it was a lot thinner and more boombox looking, and also, it looks really cool when you split them apart. You'll see later. Now, this doesn't really leave me a lot of room for humanoid hands, but who said he needs humanoid hands? Instead, I went for claws that could fold up into the arm to complete the handle. I made sure to add a slot for my human thumb to pick out his robot thumb later on, because I don't want to get these 3D printed parts stuck in there. You might have noticed by this point, Freecad was giving me some error messages in the terminal at the bottom. It turns out, when I was being lazy and just copy-pasting the pieces to test the transformation and not the entire file, I would then delete them when I didn't need them. And I also deleted the origin of the original piece. Freecad works in strange ways. So basically, it knew the object existed, but it didn't know where the object existed. So when you went to export it, it had no idea what to do. I spent ages trying to figure out how to fix this, if there was a bit of code I needed to insert. I went down old Reddit forums from 2018, which supposedly said they'd fix this bug. I don't know what I did wrong, but if there's a way to break something, I figure it out apparently. After much head scratching, I was complaining about it to a group of friends, and they said, can you just copy paste the origin from a working object and put that in instead? So I did. And it worked first try. It would still sometimes throw warnings at me, but unlike an error, a warning is something that I can ignore. So, now I can finally get to work on the lower half. I designed Soundwave's crotch in 2 halves so that I could have it clasp around a mushroom peg in the upper torso. I made the alignment pegs of both parts separate pieces, so I didn't need stupid support material that just for like a tiny overhang. This is a smart design choice that I would for some reason forget to do on the other parts of the model, but I thought I should point out that sometimes I make good choices. Now, I was convinced I would need ratchet joints for his hips to support the weight. It turns out that I didn't even need to bother, the friction was absolutely fine. But I figured I would show you this anyway because I'm quite proud of how I got the cogs and everything to align properly. I even had a slot for the spring so the tooth could fit in. Now, an iconic part of Soundwave's G1 design is his front tape deck buttons. Now, despite mine being a working tape player, these buttons aren't actually going to do anything on my model, but I just know someone would want to try and press them and see what happens. So, instead of just modeling a raised edge and painting it later, I actually made each button a separate piece with a spring channel and a peg and everything to align it so you could actually press them. Again, they don't do anything and it was a lot of extra work, but the tactile feedback is a lot more rewarding to me than seeing someone get disappointed at fake static buttons. It's by this point that I realized just how tiny his head is compared to the rest of him, so I spent 3 hours making it 1.3% bigger. 3 hours. I had to make a link group of each part of the head, which was the size I actually wanted. It was like a bigger ghost copy of the original head. That original head still exists, and when I want to tweak the model, I tweak that base head model, which then changes the bigger one. It's super jank and frustrating, but it worked. Finally, I can move on to his upper legs. On most modern Soundwave toys, he just has a fake button panel on his back, which covers the upper legs in cassette mode. But I really don't want any fake parts in my model. So instead, I took inspiration from scissor lifts of all things. They can be flat, but then they can perfectly stretch upwards while still having their main plate be in line with the base. They just go straight up. Now, I couldn't fit a scissor lift inside of the leg along with hip joints, so instead I made it so the front and back of his thighs were on a slider and rotator mechanism connected to a main part in the middle. In robot mode, they could be squished in to look more like legs, but in cassette mode, they can slide out and be flush with his crotch, so it all looks like one solid piece. It's a really tricky mechanism to explain, but it is the one that I am most proud of in this entire project because it totally worked first try. Now it's time for his lower legs. They're going to be housing some disassembled headphone speakers so he can actually play the tapes, so it was caliper time to make sure it fits. Then I designed it so the legs fold in half with a butterfly hinge, so that they can be one solid chunk in Boombox mode and one long chunk in robot mode. The foot, it gave me a lot of trouble, as it somehow needed to move from the top of his leg all the way to the bottom because of how I'd sandwiched it for the electronics and everything. My initial idea was to have a hinge that also was on a slider so it could reach all the way down. Then the foot would be more like an alien foot with extra toes to fill in the gaps in Boombox mode. But this was going to be a leg design that is already in two chunks folded in half, with all of his weight now resting on a thin slider. Plus, the extra toes just look weird. So I redesigned the whole thing. So I made it so that the hinge didn't need to extend to reach the end of the leg, and the foot was attached to the side of it instead of straight on. That way, it could fold around the remaining chunk of the leg at the bottom and lock into it. Now, I still have a giant chunk in the back of the Boombox to fill in, but before we do that, let's make his shoulder cannon. This is going to house the LED battery casing, which is a cool cone shape. So I took advantage of how sketch-based modeling can work. See, I measured the diameter of both ends of the cone, and then the distance between them. Then I did a revolution action to my sketch, which basically sort of repeats that sketch and stretches it into a cylindrical shape. Add a little border around it so that that internal sketch is actually an indent, and you've now got a shoulder cannon that perfectly fits the housing. I made the tip of the shoulder cannon a separate piece again so that I could paint it separately, and I also added a universal hinge on the back of the shoulder cannon. Now, I really struggled to figure out where to put the shoulder cannon in Boombox mode. I wanted to fit it inside the remaining gap, but it was too big. Then I thought it could be a radio antenna and have it telescope out the back, but that would have made it look even more bulky. So instead, I redesigned the entire foot and the back end of the Boombox again so that it could actually fit a shoulder cannon. I made it so that the shoulder cannon was actually attached to the torso on a slider mechanism, so that way when it folds up, it's still upright just like it was for the head, so the cables are in the right orientation and aren't getting twisted as much. I then had to find out how the heck I was going to fill in this remaining chunk. Do I give him chunks that attach to the torso and look like a backpack or wings in robot mode? Do I give him really big feet? Finally, I settled with the easiest solution, which was just to attach them to the shoulders that were right there. I added, I don't know what you would call it, like a butterfly hinge that's also on a slider. It basically just means that it can slide up and be flush with the rest of the shoulder, and swing out the way as well. So now the entire Boombox is fully fleshed out, it's got slots for electronics, it's fully capable of transforming. This is brilliant. But it looks kind of flat. It was time to add the details and greebles. I could go in and add final sketches and fillets to the outside, and I could pocket them inwards, creating indents and exdents. I'm still going for a very G1 look, so I don't need extra detail, but it's just to break up some of the monotony of the surfaces. I added things to the front of the Boombox, like obviously the giant big speaker circles. Because the shoulder pads fold over themselves, I could actually have hidden robot mode details be revealed. I also added recesses on the bottom of the Boombox that I could easily paint later to break up some of the color monotony going on. Now the handle, I wanted to have a ridge texture that ran along the whole length, but I kept it fairly simple, so in robot mode it would still match the rest of the arms. A lot of people know that on G1 Soundwave's design, he's got that red band going around his arm, so I added a little one at the top of the handle, which lines up in the right spot in robot mode. I was quite pleased with that. Something I'm particularly happy about was the text on the back. Turns out Freecad can let you use fonts that you have downloaded on your computer already, and put them straight into the software, and pad them out into 3D objects. Most of the text I just copied off an actual Boombox I own, but I also figured I could add a couple Easter eggs near the bottom. Another thing that I thought was pretty cool that I managed to do is have details like the fake battery cover actually continue across multiple pieces. It means when he's in robot mode, it looks like he's actually built out of the Boombox and not just wearing it as armor. After some final toy-inspired details on the legs, I could finally begin the printing process. Now, these were some long prints. For perspective, I could print the entirety of Ravage in 1 hour. It took me an hour and a half just to print his new, bigger head. Yeah, the entire project took 90 hours to print. Now the Prusa Mark IV gets really nice prints right off the get-go, but it's still an FDM printer and you get layer lines. So I figured instead of just waiting around while it's printing everything, I should start sanding them and adding wood filler just to get them a little bit smoother. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get these perfect super smooth because since he's a Transformer model, he actually needs to have some of those layers to keep the tolerances correct and keep the friction. I don't want to hear any complaints about the layer lines in the comments, okay? Okay? So, for the next 4 weeks, I sanded, and printed, and sanded, and printed, and sanded, and printed. And when I finished sending parts before the next batch was done, I figured I would keep myself busy and do some basic Blender animations that I could display on that iPod Touch I was talking about. I could also then use a brilliant app called Looper, which I'll link in the description below, that lets me just put the videos onto the device and it'll just keep them looping. So as long as I time the animation properly, it'll just loop seamlessly. So now I've got some animations and I've finally finished all of the sanding. It's time for my favorite part, the painting. Now I separated pieces into color groups. Like I've been saying before, I've modeled it so certain bits can be painted individually and assembled later, and then I gave them a couple coats of metallic spray paint. This also doubles as a primer for my weathering later on, and gets the base coats done nice and quick. Once that's fully dry, I can start weathering with acrylics. Now, I don't want this guy to look like a super battle-worn robot, more like a boombox that's been dumped at a garage since the 80s and not been looked after too much. To do this, I'm using some really basic weathering techniques, washes and dry brushing. For those that don't know, a wash is not where we clean parts. Instead, I water down some dark paint, I just went full black for this, and then I wipe it all over the model, trying to get it as much to the recesses as possible. Then, I wipe most of it off, leaving it to fill in the indents to give it a more shaded look. Dry brushing, however, is exactly what it sounds like. You take most of the paint off, so it's basically dry, and then you just hit the edges, giving it highlights. Now, when I'm painting my model, I think of two major things. What is the object's story that I'm trying to convey, and is it easy for me to understand that object? The story doesn't have to be anything more complicated than it's an old 80s boombox. With that in mind, I look for references of images of old boomboxes online, and I look at the most common things that tend to happen to them. Plastic gets scuffs, the recesses gather dirt, the chrome parts tend to get a bit dulled. These little details make a big difference. Now the second thing, is it easy to understand the object? When I first used the silver spray paint, it was super shiny and glossy, and you could not see any of the details. It was basically just a silhouette. With the washes, I gave the parts shading, and with the dry brushes, I gave the parts highlights. And just like a 2D painting, you can subtly understand the raised and recessed parts of the model just from a glance. That's why I love weathering. It does so much to tell you about the object, but it's also a relatively easy and quick process to do. Now with everything painted, it's finally time to work on the electronics. You see, I'm using speakers I took from an old set of headphones. Headphones that I broke the wires of right at the last minute. Thankfully, it was actually a fairly easy fix. I literally just needed to solder them back together. There was no extra of hardware to add or whatnot. But I was kind of terrified because it's something that's completely new to me. It's not like anything I've done before. But I've done it now, and I can continue to add that to the list of new skills I learned during this project. The last piece I need to sort before I can do the final glue up is his visor. I had printed out the visor that I had modelled in the CAD so that I could align the mouth plate. But I want his eyes to glow and light up, right? He's going to have LEDs. I tried using the 3D print like a buck and stretching clear plastic over it after I'd heated it up, but I don't have a vacuum box, so I just kept getting wrinkles. Then I tried tracing the outline of the print onto clear plastic, painting it yellow and doing it that way, but the paint kept chipping off. So the method I did that actually worked was I traced the outline onto clear plastic again, then I put a layer of yellow washi tape over it, I put a layer of double-sided sticky tape over that, and to finish this sandwich of translucent materials, I put another clear plastic layer over it. That way it's got the yellow from the washi tape, double-sided sticky tape doesn't show any glue, and the clear plastic on the final end gives it that correct shiny texture. So finally, after 2 months solid of work of designing, modeling, printing, sanding, painting, you name it, I could finally do the glue up. And I gotta say, it's one of the coolest things I've ever made.
In disguise. The Transformers, more than meets the eye. The Transformers, the Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. Transformers, more than meets the eye. Transformers, the Transformers, Autobots in disguise. The Transformers, more than meets the eye. The Transformers, the Transformers. Transformers, more than meets the eye. Transformers, Autobots in disguise. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. The Transformers.
How freaking cool is that? It is the world's first transformable working cassette player, and it's got the schematics in the torso. I think it's safe to say I'm very pleased with how this turned out. Like I said before, It's a project I've wanted to do for over 4 years. In fact, I actually found that old Tinkercad file I was talking about, and wow, how far I've come. To see it finally finished and actually pulled off to a quality I'm happy with, I'm just very proud of myself. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you've got any Transformers fans in your life that you think would enjoy this video, send it their way, and until next time, I'll see you later. Farewell!